In the last lecture, we made sure that we can handle errors. And with that, we got a robust application which allows us to post our orders to our backend. That already is a lot. Now, there's one more thing I want to do though. I also want to be able to get some data from the backend. And why don't we get our ingredients from there? So the ingredients which we set up like this, why don't we get the ingredients dynamically from the backend? For that, let's go to Firebase first, and let's close the orders node. Now let's add a new node by clicking on the plus directly next to your root name here. And let's name this ingredients. Then add this plus here on the right to add a nested element. And their ingredients should really just be our key value pairs. So there we might have salad with a value of 0. Click this add button then. And now add more. Let's add meat with a value of 0. Let's add bacon with a value of 0. So I'm using the same ingredients as before because I only support these. But you could, of course, now add more to both your front-end code and your backend. And let me also add cheese here. And of course, you could also set up different starting values. So now we get that ingredients node. Here is the URL to it. You need to append .json to really access it though. And now the goal is to initialize our ingredients here with the ingredients we just stored on Firebase. So still in the burger builder component, I want to set up the state dynamically. And you learned that a good place for fetching data is component did mount. So this is the method I want to use. So I'll add it here, component did mount like this. And there I now want to reach out with Axios. So I'm using Axios with a get request and reach out to that URL I just copied with .json at the end. So this will now send a request to get our ingredients. I'll then add a then block here to handle the response we get back. And that response should of course contain our ingredients object. So now the goal is to set our state here, ingredients, to that object. So I'm actually going to set this to null initially here because we're now fetching it from the database. And there I will now call this set state and set ingredients equal to response. And there will be a data object which actually contains the data we fetched. Now, if we save that and we go back to our application here, you see we get an error. Because now when we try to loop through our ingredients at the start of the app, that of course fails because initially ingredients is now null. We're only fetching it at the start. And that's a typical use case in applications. You fetch data when it loads. So parts of the UI which depend on the data will therefore fail. Now this of course can easily be prevented by checking if we have ingredients before rendering anything which depends on ingredients, like the burger here. Now there are a couple of ways where we can handle this. I want to handle it here in my container. I want to show a spinner instead of the burger and instead of the build controls whilst I am waiting for the ingredients to load. So to do that, I'll add another variable here, which I'll name burger. And this will be the burger and the build control. So I'll cut it from there and assign it to that variable. And now, of course, this will fail due to us having adjacent elements here in JSX, which is not liked by default, as you learned. But you can either return an array or use our aux helper component here, essentially. So I'll wrap it with that. Keep in mind, that's not rendering anything to the screen, so we're not destroying our layout. But burger should, of course, actually only be that if we have ingredients. So I'll actually override a variable burger, which I'll set prior to that, burger, where I will use the spinner. And then I only want to override it if this state ingredients is basically not null. So that will only be the case if it was loaded. So I'll move my code where I override the burger variable inside of this if statement. So now by default, the burger is just a spinner. And now I can output it here below the modal. I'll output burger with single curly braces, However, we'll also face another issue. The order summary will also use the ingredients and therefore fail. So here we should simply also add something and set order summary to null by default, and then add the same check, or actually we already have that check of course, where we override that order summary variable with the order summary if ingredients are set. So let's add this after this burger code here maybe. So now we are overwriting the order summary in that same if statement we created a second ago. Of course, I also want to make sure that we override this again if loading was set. So after this if statement where we check for ingredients, I'll add this old if statement where we check for the loading state to override order summary when needed. So now when we save this and go back to the application, you saw that spinner for the fraction of a second, and thereafter you can get going and you can create that burger, which you can see is still handled correctly. So this all works. The cool thing now is if we go to Firebase and we update our ingredients so that, for example, we always start with meat, we can simply set meat to 1 here and confirm with enter, and then go back to our burger, and if we now reload it, you see we already start with 1 meat, so that's pretty cool. So now we're also fetching this from the backend, and now we really improved our application and we have both a post and a get request. Now the cool thing is we're showing the spinner, but if we now are removing the JSON end here of our URL where we're getting the ingredients, just as an example, if we're removing that and we go back, we don't get the error modal. Now that's not cool. Why are we not getting that? That can be hard to spot. The reason actually can be found in our with error handler function. We're setting up our intersetters in the component did mount hook, and it worked great for the post request. But think about that lifecycle diagram. There you see component did mount is actually called after all child components have been rendered, which means after component did mount was completed in the child components. Now, think about our with error handler. Here we're wrapping this wrapped component, which is our burger builder container, for example, because there we are using with error handler on the export. So we're essentially wrapping the burger builder. And that of course has one implication. Component did mount in the with error handler will only be called once component did mount was called here. And since we reach out to the web in component did mount of the wrapped component, we never set up our intersetters. The fix is simple. We use component will mount. This will be called before the child components are rendered. And we're not causing side effects here. We're just registering the intersetters. And we want to do that before the child components are rendered. Now with that, if we save this and we reload the application, we get that error modal, but then we get another error that we fail to set our state. The reason for this is that the then block gets executed in our burger builder even though we have an error. Now the reason for that simply is that we're not having a catch method here in component did mount of the burger builder. If we catch an error there and simply don't do anything with it, for example, then we will already not get this anymore, because now we're not calling the then block anymore. We can still dismiss the network error and our application is now broken, so we probably would want to handle that specific error case here for this specific page by, for example, also setting the UI here. So there we could also set some error state. So now in the burger builder, which is null initially, or false maybe. And then inside here, if we get an error, if we catch this, then we call set state and set error to true. Now with that, we can go down to the render method and we want to output an error message for this case where our application becomes unusable. Here we set burger to spinner. Now we actually don't want to show the spinner, but the application is not usable at all. Error message if we have the error equal to true. So here we could check if this state error If that is true, then we actually want to show a paragraph where we say ingredients can't be loaded. This is our worst case scenario. Otherwise, we're showing the spinner or we're overriding it with the ingredients if we got them. So now if we save this, we got the spinner, and then we see ingredients can't be loaded. Now our application is broken, but at least we show it to the user. Of course, once we fix that link by adding .json at the end again, now of course the ingredients will load. As you can see here, we see the spinner for a fraction of a second, the ingredients are there, and we can continue using our application just fine. So this is now all working. Now we get a really robust application where we are both storing orders and we're fetching content. Now, of course, we could also implement code to fetch the orders from our database, from our backend here. So that is something we want to work on next. Routing, being able to switch pages, even though technically we only have one page in that single page application.